the more you buy, the more you save, calling it sort of CEO math. And this year, he's more like the more you buy, the more you make.
Jury decision in New Mexico exposes is that there's a difference between somebody posting something.
So that's Instar, Instar.sh is the website. Something to watch. It's sort of a developer-oriented OpenClaw-like thing.
And then there was a bubble that was 4 years after that, but it turns out that it's not due to the fundamental frequency. It's due to a harmonic frequency for those of you who play music.
ASML exited 2025 with something like 40 to 45 billion backlog.
Welcome to the Orion X Download Podcast. Join Shaheen Khan, the Orion X analysts, and special guests as they discuss and simplify the big ideas in technology that are changing the world. Thank you for being with us.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Orion X Download Analyst Roundtable. That's a bit of a mouthful, but OXD art kind of works. This is the 12th episode of the art series. And with me, as usual, is Chris Krull, Adrian Cockcroft, and Stephen Perroneau, all of us scattered around the world. Gentlemen, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Yeah.
Adrian, you've been doing all the fun stuff.
Yeah, I bought a house in England in January. I've been fixing it up, installing networking, doing electrical work, all that kind of stuff. I did manage to make it up to London for the Monkey Gra Red Monk conference last week, which was quite fun. Give a little talk there. And then it's springtime here and the trees have leaves on them and stuff and flowers are out. So that's actually brightening things up a bit.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm envisioning the famous English garden scene.
Yeah, it's coming along.
So have you had any time to play around with technology?
Well, other than installing networking equipment, I haven't. I've been trying to track what's going on with the overall developments and things. And unfortunately, this year I missed GTC because I wasn't in the right country at the right time. So I think it's probably
Good
the best
segue
place
into
to
GTC.
Yeah, let's just start talking what happened to GTC. I'm curious to see what you thought of it.
So I was there in person. They had 30,000 people in person in San Jose. My joke was that anything that touches NVIDIA goes in short supply because that includes coffee and includes food, because all the coffee shops and restaurants were overtaken by vendors, like completely. We actually managed to walk by a coffee shop and somebody said, if you sign up to this and do a QR code like this, you can just come in and have free coffee on behalf of one of the big vendors. So we were grateful for that. But just absolutely packed. Which is, of course, the indication that AI remains a hot topic, and also NVIDIA remains a dominant player, also semi-duh. Others are improving, but not quite as much. They had a whole series of announcements. The tone of the show seemed to have morphed from kind of a technology consumer deployment to a little bit more of not losing any of that, but adding more of a business metrics revenue stream, kind of going up the stack, which is really what the industry needs to do, is to show that it can actually make money. Some witty person said that Jensen used to say, the more you buy, the more you save, calling it sort of CEO math. And this year, he's more like the more you buy, the more you make, which I consider to be a stronger message and also has an expanded audience that includes vendors. He was a bit unabashed to say, everybody in the audience, you all had a banner year, kind of the implication being that it was all his partners. And people were there from everywhere, from every company, from every part of the world, from every walk of life, so to say, from students to government agencies to international players from really every country you could imagine. They ran out of booth space at the convention center. So they commandeered a parking lot between the Signia Hotel and the Westin Hotel and turned that into a sort of a cabana-like booths on two sides. And of course, San Jose was unseasonably very hot. I think it pushed towards 90 degrees on one of the days. So they parked the ice cream truck dishing out free ice cream for people to come into the parking lot to generate some traffic for the vendors that were there. That was kind of nice. Reportedly, something like 120 or more robots were present at the show, all around town as well as in the convention center. But also because like I like to say, demos being demos, and things can go wrong, you could sort of see people standing in a corner with their hands behind their back, fiddling with the control unit, operating the robots, while everybody else thought they're kind of autonomous. So there is a bit of that. They had a series of announcements. I would say that besides the robotics front, that includes their Groot software and a bunch of other things, there were also a bunch of enterprise software announcements. It sort of was reminiscent of JDBC in the old days when you tried to kind of integrate with legacy data center applications. So they had a whole interface with SQL databases, ETL, extract, transform, load, compression, decompression, like, working with IBM, which of course, invented SQL, the language, but also with BigQuery from Google and SQL Server, Microsoft, and Amazon's equivalent, etc., to try to kind of get more baked into the enterprise. I thought that was pretty significant. And then the main play, of course, was the Vera Rubin platform that was introduced yet again, but this time launched a little bit more formally, and expectations set that it will be shipping later this year. That allows them to launch it yet again this year before it actually ships, and then yet again after it starts shipping. Um, they didn't say much about Feynman. So even though he kind of pointed to it last year and said that's on the roadmap, this time it was more about Vera Rubin Ultra and beyond.
You usually
And also,
find that when you're doing product announcements like that, when a product is far enough into the future, you start talking about it. And as it
right.
comes closer, you actually shut up about it, because then you're kind of like osborning yourself too much, right? So you have to kind of shut up about that one to get the current one out, and then you go, okay. And there's that thing we mentioned before that will be ready. So there's always a sort of a cycle there. You can tell
That's right.
something's getting close because the people stop talking about it, right?
That's right. That's right. Very, very good point. And then they did have a board with the new Grok IP that they acquired just a couple of months ago. So that execution is pretty good. And they are hiring people for the language processing unit, part of what they do. And right now they're keeping the Grok thing just its own separate product. And they said the combination can let you have multiple cakes and eat them too, sort of a thing. So they had some kind of a positioning, especially for inference. And then they made a really big deal about OpenClaw. They have a version of it called Nemotron, Nemo coming from another product that they started. I believe they may be unaware that NEMA, NEMA, is already a thing in the industry on the industrial automation part. And it's like, National Association of, Manufacturing, something, something. And it's got some kind of a compliance requirements that goes with it. So NEMA and NEMO are two different things. And NEMO, NEMO, is the NVIDIA thing. So they had Nemoclaw, that is like an enterprise version or wrapper around OpenClaw. And they made a really big deal about that. They pointed out that OpenClaw has been adopted faster than Linux was. And it's like within a couple of months, it has surpassed all manner of things. And every company must have an OpenClaw strategy. They obviously see that as drivers of GPU sales. The other thing that I got from his talk was a push towards higher levels of the stack. NVIDIA was a chip company, then it was a server company, then it was a rack company, then rows of racks, then AI factory, and then, I need power and land and cooling and infrastructure and software. And I think he was pushing the industry to go up the stack, get closer to applications, try to actually get to the use cases that actually generate money. There was definitely that vibe. And of course, NVIDIA sees the scenery change probably better than anybody because they are leading the market. They are attending more meetings with more people in more countries. So there is something to be said about their advice as you kind of glean it. It's probably good advice, in other words, and you would do well to heed it.
Yeah, well, going up the stack isn't surprising. I mean, they've been at this CUDA thing for 20 years, right? And, from a competitive perspective, it only deepens the moat because you have these other large companies developing their own processors. And so the competitive advantage, at least from a surface level, ends up being the stack. And, they're of the heft that they get to push into various verticals with some sophistication, right? So it's one, it makes sense, and two, it's good for them, right?
A couple of years ago at GTC, I was one of the student paper, the student board, what do they call them, things, demo boards, but there's a thing called SiriusDB that was being developed out of a university somewhere, and the SiriusDB that's being developed out of a university, and the student was there, and I chatted to him a bit and ran into him again later that year at High Performance Transaction Systems workshop, and then talked to them for a while, and they were trying to figure out whether to spin out a company or not. And underneath, it's running on top of the CUDA database, there's a CUDA DB thing. But anyway, they ended up just joining NVIDIA rather than kicking up a company. Let's just go and join NVIDIA. So NVIDIA has this SiriusDB project they're sponsoring, and it's a DuckDB compatible database that runs entirely in GPU memory. And since GPU memory is now getting, the address spaces of these systems is now becoming huge because it's a unified GPU address space within one of the MVL racks, they're able to run very large. That was always the problem with running databases within GPUs, right? You want to store all the data in there. But the idea being that you want to prepare the data that you're going to feed into your compute, whatever inference or training run, by extracting it using SQL queries and slice and dice. You want to do that inside the GPU itself rather than doing it and having to shovel the data back and forth. So that's another one to keep a watch out for. They open sourced it, and then NVIDIA is supporting it. So it's kind of an interesting one to track.
We should probably just even mention that one of the feature sets that Jensen talked about in regard to Nemotron was the security features that they're layering on top of OpenClaw, right? So there's kernel level sandboxing, for example. And one of the cool things about that, the policy engine itself is running outside of the agent. So the agent can't change the security levels of what it's doing on the fly. It can only reduce what it's able to do. Shipping, Nemotron ships with the default policy that it's denying network access except those that are explicitly called out, which is a good thing versus what OpenClaw ships as default. There's some features built around what data you can exfiltrate from what you have access to. And there's other features like that. There's an audit trail and compliance feature built into Nemotron. So, and this is all early days, right? It's just posted to GitHub the other day. It's definitely pre-production, but they're looking for community support and help in identifying some of the bugs and vulnerabilities. I don't recall hearing a target date for when they would consider this in production, but I would imagine some of their enterprise customers are kicking the tires on this and doing with it what they will, right? So
yeah,
I think that's, to the point that OpenClaw is becoming such a big thing, to have that kind of level of security layered on is absolutely essential for trust to be built.
They positioned it as an enterprise grade, and the sandboxing that you referred to was explicitly called out. And Adrian, referencing your comment last time we had this session, when you said if people see benefit, they will absorb the risk. So sandboxing reduces that risk for the enterprise, and I think it's probably the big deal.
Yeah, I think OpenClaw's moving to enterprise now, but the pace of change in the investment rate in OpenClaw is very high. The numbering scheme they have is based on dates. So I just saw a YouTube blog post that 3.22, which is a version number, but it actually means March the 22nd's version of this, had a bazillion new features added to it. And then, because now we have 3.24 is out now because it's 2 days later, and there's a whole lot more stuff been added. So the pace of change is accelerating, and it's feeding itself because we now have the AI is accelerating the ability to build itself. So we're on this accelerating path, and as more people use OpenClaw with it, more GitHub stars than anything else now. It passed whatever React, I think, was the previous winner for a piece of code that's really only a few months old. So the investment level in this is huge. There's more than 10,000 skills or whatever they're called that you can plug into it in the OpenClaw sort of plugin library. I've just been a bit too busy to play with it, and I'm getting stuck on this thing that everything is getting better so fast that if I wait another week, it gets a lot better. And so at some point, I have to pick a version and just dive in when I get some time and try this. And then there's similar. It's OpenClaw is both a repo full of code that people are using, but it's also a pattern that people are copying. So there's a thing called NanoClaw, which is a rebuild using containers to be very much more safe architecturally with much less code in it. So that's another approach. And then there's another thing called Instar, which is interesting. Instar. Justin Headley posted this blog post recently, and a few months ago he built something which has basically got a mind of its own, literally right now. So it's like OpenClaw with a memory system behind it for development work. So it's more like sort of Gastown and Open and Claude Flow in some sense that he was doing it for development, but he built some short, medium, and long-term memory and context so that the system would every day know what it had done the day before. It was pointing it at programming tasks. And then he just basically got an update from it every day of what it had decided to do that day and was just reviewing the work it was doing. It was just running continuously. Then he realized at some point they'd been collaborating on a totally different project with somebody else for a week. And so it's kind of literally got a mind of its own and is off developing, fixing itself, adding code to itself. So we've kind of got into this feedback loop system now. So that's Instar, instar.sh is the website. Something to watch. It's sort of a developer-oriented OpenClaw-like thing. And then the other thing that bugs me with these is that a lot of them seem to be using Telegram as the control interface to it, along with WhatsApp or maybe other more messaging options. OpenClaw has lots of options, but a lot of people using Telegram. I don't know about you guys, but I always thought Telegram was a bit sketchy as a place to be using. And I think it's just that it has an easy API for integration. But I know what you think about controlling things through social media and who controls that social media.
Yeah, well, the joke is decide who you want to have your data, and depending on who you think it does, you pick. But I don't know whether there is conclusive evidence. Many people favor Signal because it's open source and encrypted and this, that, and the other. But it seems like Telegram and then WhatsApp provide lots of capabilities for people to form groups and engagements and transactions and this, that, and the other. And that ease of adding those capabilities pulls people in for something like this. There are things that agents can do within these systems that go beyond just messaging. So that might be the reason.
Yeah, I think I'm going to try WhatsApp rather than create a Telegram account and get into that. I think that if you look at who owns all these things, I already have some stuff on Facebook and a WhatsApp account. So that's a bit,
right.
I may as well just stick with
they
that.
They already know everything about you anyway, right?
Yeah. No, I don't have very much stuff on Facebook. I avoid the Facebook Messenger.
No, that's right. That's right.
And things like that.
I don't see you there much these days. Yeah. All right, Dr. Perno, crypto continues to be a major topic technologically, economically, socially. What's the latest there? I saw some of your research that you've posted on your Substack as well as on various platforms. It all looks fantastic as usual. So give us an update.
Yeah, well, what I've been working on very intensively since the latter part of Q3 last year is trying to understand the nature of Bitcoin's bubbles. And there have been 4 major bubbles in 2011, 2013, 2017, and 2021. And the bulk of the community was expecting that there would be another bubble in 2025 because everyone had gotten it into their heads that there was a 4-year linear cycle. And the reason why they had, and I was guilty of this, earlier on as well, was that the halvings are on a 4-year schedule. So it's sort of natural to think, okay, the halvings drive the bubble and the bubble peaks about a year to 18 months after the halving. That was kind of the general consensus. Well, I think it's all a myth. And in fact, the myth, is disproven by the very first bubble because it happened in 2011 when Bitcoin was only age 2.4. years, having started in January of 2009. And the second bubble then happened, when it was age 4.5 roughly, so only 2 years later. And then the next bubble was about 4 years later. And then there was a bubble that was 4 years after that. But it turns out that it's not due to the fundamental frequency. It's due to a harmonic frequency for those of you who play music. We people can't see this, but Chris has got his guitar behind him on the wall. So, harmonic in the same sense of the next, octave up in a scale. So it turns out that Giovanni Santastasi, who is the founder and director of the Scientific Bitcoin Institute, had 7 years ago, in April of 2019, put out a model that had a log periodic component. He had come onto the power law nature of Bitcoin in the sort of early realization in 2012, 2013, and he continued over several years to kind of validate that and put more theoretical foundation onto that. And that comes from the growth in addresses and the Metcalfe's law that applies to networks. And people who are familiar with Metcalfe's law applying to communication networks and the internet and social networks know that the value of the network goes up roughly as a square of the number of users. It's kind of this n times n minus 1 over 2. It cannot grow quite as fast sometimes, but it's close to that. It's close to a square law. Well, if you have the number of users of Bitcoin grow as the cube of its age, which is what you measure, then you get the square of that. So you get a very steep power law approaching the 6th power. And that's what's observed. Bitcoin's power comes in at 5.7 to 5.8, depending on what technique you use for your regression. It's a straight line in log-log space. That's a power law. But then to get back to this question as to what are these large excursions, because the volatility has been very large. At one point, the volatility was kind of 100% level, and now it's sort of 40% level. It's gradually come down, and that's consistent with the power law. But what about the timing? So he had suggested that, and it turns out that the projection that he made when he published that was that there would be the next fundamental peak would not happen until the beginning of 2027, the very end of this year, beginning of 2027. And then he kind of didn't follow up on it, strangely. And he fell into this same trap of this 4-year cycle that most of us did and was trying to model around that. But I was getting more and more worried as we went through the first half of 2025 and trying to understand the difference between the core and the bubble. So finally in October, I figured it out. And I said, look, this is a power law. That is continuous scale invariance. If you have something that displays continuous scale invariance, if it gets interrupted by exogenous forces, it may manifest discrete scale invariance. And the way that that normally would be manifested would be in terms of log periodic behavior, where the bubbles would be spread out in logarithmic time, because it takes logarithmic time to grow the whole network by that certain ratio. In other words, with the power law of Bitcoin, if the age increases by 50%, the value goes up by an order of magnitude. If it doubles, it goes up by 60 times. That's been the history of it. So that should leak over into discrete scale invariance, and then these bubbles should be stretched out. So I went and did Fourier analysis, and lo and behold, it fit. And then you just had to explain the 2021 bubble, and you could do that by saying, okay, the first harmonic, the first higher frequency. So we isolated the parameter for that. It's an angular frequency of 9, but it means that currently the time between bubbles is something like 9 to 10 years. So having had the last one, and with more data now, we don't expect the next one until mid-2028 once you include the phase. So these things are just cyclical, where you have like a cosine. So we're doing the high school version right now, which is you just have a cosine with a frequency times time, except you change the time variable to be log of time. That's the key. And then there's the phase. And then you can match everything very nicely. But our most recent realization Giovanni and I together on this, and I'm very happy to be part of the Scientific Bitcoin Institute as well as the associate director. We found that there is this coupling between the exponent that describes the power law, which is this number close to 6, 5.7, 5.8, that's the power law index, and a spacing parameter, which is about 2. So in other words, these bubbles are a factor of 2 further apart. The duration between any pair and the subsequent pair gets longer by roughly a factor of 2. And he and I agree that that number is like 2.01, 2.03. We've got it nailed down. And I've done this with Fourier analysis. I've done this with wavelet analysis. I've looked at the timing between peaks. I've looked at the timing between troughs. And most recently, I looked at the timing using something called Loam-Scargill, which is a variation. It's kind of like doing Fourier analysis. Now, this is my comment about AI. It's because I'm able to use AI to do all the coding that I've been able to do all this work, in some number of months very quickly. And the correctness of the coding has gone up drastically just from 6 months ago. So that's all very impressive in terms of what it can do, and also just the discussions with it as you use it as a research associate and sounding board. But coming back to the model, we've also validated that with some things called Hurst and DFA that show the persistence of this. But we've shown this coupling between these two numbers, this 5.8 and this for the continuous stuff, and this 2 for the ratio of when these peaks happen. They're coupled. And they're coupled in a way which adheres to something called renormalizable groups. And there's this hidden variable inside the overall structure. So if you have something that is self-organizing structure, that Bitcoin is, it's what we call autopoietic, because it creates itself. It creates its own coin through its own process, its own consensus algorithm. It manages itself. It organizes itself. Yes, it has the external influences of energy and the human networks that create the mining machines and, the data farms that are sitting out there in West Texas. There are humans involved. There are humans involved in buying and selling, but all of the rules are intrinsic. And that's what ultimately enforces the structure that happens both power law and log periodic. And so I've just posted another article on this on Substack within the past hour. And we'll talk about it. We have a Physics of Bitcoin show every week, Wednesday, 7 p.m. So later today, that's Pacific time, with Giovanni and I, and we'll talk about this. In terms of the market overall, we had a big pullback from a peak of 125,000 the first week of October. We went down into the low 60s, so that's a factor of 2. And that was all demonstrating that we did not have a bubble in 2025. We adhered to the power law, and then we collapsed below it. So it was supportive evidence for this idea that we're not going to have the next one until 2028, the next major bubble, but we're going to be back on an uptrend. And by looking at the fundamental and the next harmonic, we can actually demonstrate that there should have been this decrease in Q4. And we can explain about half of the decrease. And that's in the article that I just posted. And it turns out that a lot of the energy has moved from the fundamental to the harmonic. And so the harmonic had a big effect and was helping with the downdraft. And it's not that the harmonic causes the price to go down. What happens is the network becomes less supportive of the macro liquidity that's entering into the Bitcoin network. So you either have constructive interference or destructive interference as the exogenous factors act on the endogenous structural factors. So our expectation is that, we can start moving up again. It looks like we bounced off 60s. We're getting back into the 70s. And the interesting thing from the global macro perspective is that recently, with the development with the war in Iran, Bitcoin has gone from 12 ounces of gold to 16 ounces of gold. That was an increase of 1/3 very rapidly in the 3-week period. In other words, gold collapsed. A lot of people thought gold would go up. reason why it didn't is interest rates shot up by 40 or more basis points. And that's negative for gold price. Bitcoin, on the other hand, responded favorably to that. I think because people see Bitcoin around the possibility of a shift in the global monetary regime and the questions raised about dollar dominance around the petrodollar history.
You just covered like a half a dozen pretty important insights in what you described. So I highly recommend our listeners to go back and listen to it a couple of more times. Certainly, I'm going to. It's excellent. Very, very nicely done.
Yeah, maybe
What do
some
you
of the
think about that macro issue, though? With gold and the petrodollar and
But we've got a new supply constraint, right, in the Gulf of
energy.
Hormuz.
Yeah.
Like we're trying to get oil through there, and I think sulfur and helium, and some of these go into the chip production. There was one report saying, well, the US defense industry depends upon stuff that is no longer flowing through. So they've got to build more weapons and things, but they need the sulfur and helium and to make the chips to do that. So there's some interesting things going on there. And I saw that the only oil that's flowing through there right now is Iranian oil, and they're doing that in Chinese currency. And they're paying, getting taxes and things like that, basically. They're doing tariffs on that. So there's some interesting changes going on there. And I think the other thing with Iran is that there's no benefit to them for getting out of this early. They want to make this so painful that no one ever does this again, right? They want to make it really clear they control the Gulf. And so I don't see they have a big incentive to roll over and say, okay, we're done with this.
It's a major disruption to supply chain, of course. And as you mentioned, oil gets the banner, but there's other things that are derivative of oil that are very important. And you also mentioned that some transactions have switched to one, and that's going to have an impact as well. Some people see it as setting a precedent and some not. The complexity of an event like that is really probably exceeds anybody's ability to be too predictive about it. So I think a lot of...
If you're trying to manage things, most companies operated in a complicated domain. There's this sort of Cynefin thing for understanding which domains you're in. They're used to dealing with complicated things. And then if you're in a new market, it's more of a complex, you get a complex adaptive system kind of thing. But war is chaotic. And when you're in the markets right now and the way we're operating, both with AI is a chaotic environment because it's moving too fast. It's creating its own little bubbles and frothiness, if you like, because it's not diffusing evenly because it's changing too quickly. And so you have to operate your company in a mode that is understanding how you deal with chaotic things. And the way that works is you have to have rules of engagement. And you basically, because you have to act, you can't sense what to do because the thing you're sensing is changing. It's not predictive anymore. So there's basically, act, see what happens, figure it out what to do next, right? But you have to act first. And that's not at all comfortable for people that are used to running enterprises and any kind of business. But it's much more of this, it's much more like in war, you have your rules of engagement and you have to just act first and see what happens later. And I think that's causing a lot of disruption around. But there's, if you can figure out how to operate your business in that mode, then you're going to survive or at least do a bit better than there are people around you.
Yeah, so I think that is likely, unless it quiets down quickly, and that's a possibility as well. Because like you mentioned, the complexity of it all also implies that there are multiple random variables that could go one way or another, depending on parameters that we don't understand. But unless it quiets down, I believe this will have an impact even on the AI market, because obviously it relies on energy, but as you mentioned, also on technology, and some of the materials play a big role in the supply chain there.
We're seeing the AI market moving from the sort of exploration phase where people are just throwing context and tokens at everything. So people are now starting to manage tokens and okay, this is a token efficient, optimized way. So we're getting some very rapid improvements in optimization, the number of tokens you actually need to get things done, orders of magnitude improvements as people figure out how to focus attention just on the things that matter rather than like recomputing things from first principles every day kind of level of stuff. So I think that we've got plenty of opportunity to take the capacity we have now and use it vastly more efficiently if that starts to become constrained. So I think that there's that, we're in that sort of phase. But even if the war hadn't happened, we were still in a chaotic state because of the rate of change of AI. It's unprecedented. It's working at the sweet spot of what works is getting bigger quickly. And it's just incredibly disruptive across lots of different markets. And then there's a war on top of that, which is just messing everything up.
I think that's an excellent point, that AI already was causing some chaotic behavior, adding major complexity. And then this is on top of that. That's an interesting.
Anything that grows exponentially is inherently unstable. And power laws are much more stable systems. So with Bitcoin, it operates actually at the edge of chaos. So it's that sort of that boundary between order and chaos. But with AI, we're super exponential. We're growing faster than exponential, right? And then war is chaotic in a whole different way. And all the supply line disruption, you can't even fit those to any known function, right? And worry about diesel, because you can't do anything without diesel, right? In you want to build a new data center, you need diesel.
You need to also feed people and fertilizer.
And you need fertilizer.
There's more fundamental stuff. We're going down that Maslow's pyramid thing to the bottom level. We're going, okay, we need some basic stuff here. But yeah.
Well, I've been saying half jokingly for a long time that going up the Maslow triangle is just really hard.
Got to keep building those pyramids on the backs of all of that labor, probably mostly, captive slave labor.
But we can go talk about it on social media, assuming we're old enough to do so, right, Chris?
Yes, we do need to be old enough to do so.
What is the latest on that?
Yeah, just the other day, a court in New Mexico has ordered Meta to pay something like $375 million for misleading users over the safety of it. And this is a jury. The jury found Meta liable for the way its platforms were engaging with children and exposing them to sexually explicit materials. The shield that these platforms have been hiding behind, to use some loaded words, are the First Amendment, and here in the States anyway, and Section 230, again here in the States, which shields them from liability for anything posted on their platforms. What this jury decision in New Mexico exposes is that there's a difference between somebody posting something and the company actively manipulating the visibility of such posts. This whole case came about because there was a former engineering manager at Meta, right, who quit in 2021 and he became a whistleblower. And he talked about the various experiments he was running on Instagram as a Meta employee that showed underage users were served sexualized content. And
wow.
So at one point, the state actually presented a piece of evidence showing that something like 16% of all Instagram users were served unwanted nudity or sexual activity posts in the space of a week, which is mind-boggling. So we'll see where this goes, right? Because Meta, of course, will appeal. They're saying that, they've always acted in the best interests of the safety of their users, et cetera, et cetera. And I just coincidentally have noticed more ads being served up on YouTube, for example, about teen Instagram, which is supposed to take a step toward validating people's birthdays and so forth so that they're old enough to be on the platform. But there's a couple other cases out there, right? There's speaking of juries, there's a case in Los Angeles that's with a jury right now where a 20-year-old has sued YouTube and I can't remember the other company claiming that they've cultivated addictive behavior. So we'll see where this one goes. This coming summer, there's a half dozen school districts in the United States that are teaming up to sue some social media companies, again, on the addiction front. But they're citing medical science showing that the dopamine reaction to social media posts and doom scrolling is similar to the addiction you find from opioids and heroin. As I understand it, there are many, many, many cases brewing in the courts. So while there's been a hue and cry for several years about these platforms need to be regulated, et cetera, we've observed how this just isn't becoming possible through Congress or even at the state level. Some states have enacted some legislation, but at the end of the day, we have parents and school districts and so forth who are raising their hands, and ultimately, I think it's going to be a community that ends up enforcing and regulating and forcing these companies to do something. So, anyway, that's the latest on that front.
That's very interesting. I think the part about the editorial, so to say, but because these platforms choose what to show you, they become responsible. In my mind, part of the interesting aspect of that is scale. Because if they could show everything to everyone, then they wouldn't have to choose. But it seems to me that, A, they would benefit from doing so, but also the sheer scale of what's happening makes it impossible to do so. So there are technological reasons why they have to choose. But then the moment you touch it, now you're complicit.
Yeah, and for those of us who have been early days with Twitter and Facebook and so forth, we've seen the algorithmic changes over time, right? Once upon a time, you saw everything from everybody.
Right.
And as you point out, the scale just makes it impossible. There's just no way to be able to do that. So companies are choosing the algorithms that we all end up being addicted to. So
yeah, the algorithm isn't just the audience. It's
Yep.
All right. What else?
Oh, I just want to throw in one news item that hit over the last couple of days. That is, SK Hynix has ordered $8 billion worth of machines from ASML, and they're going to be putting those by the end of 2027 into a couple of manufacturing facilities in South Korea. ASML exited calendar 2025 with something like a 40 to 45 billion US dollar backlog. So we're talking about a 20% addition to that. So anyway, that they're going after alleviating the memory shortage, which of course flies in the face of the chaos that we were talking about a few minutes ago in terms of supply chain. So
but really all of that is like 2028 phenomena. The shortage is going to continue, and it is structural. Adrian, you were saying?
Yeah, well, the problem is that it takes a while to respond to the shortage, and when you get a shortage, you get overbuying. So then there's a phantom extra demand, and then people overbuild into that, and then you get a glut. So it's because of the time delay to respond to the shortage. You will always end up with a boom and bust cycle, and people are sort of trying to counterweigh that because it's pretty obvious that everyone's doing that. But after a while, you go, we just have to get some more capacity in, so we'll do that. And then
somehow
that there is a good enough price for that capacity at the point where you actually have that capacity. And the same thing happening with data centers and energy as well, right? So I guess maybe the final topic that we chatted about a bit.
Well, I was going to make a crack about somehow we've got to feed Jensen's $1 trillion pipeline. So
right,
they're both a victim of and causing the memory shortage, right? So
well, the pro tip here is build stuff that people want to buy.
Does it come with the PhD course in marketing?
Well, we're trying to stay in high school, as Adrian and Steve were saying. But speaking of that class of insight, there's also one of, I was thinking that with NVIDIA launching so many different products across such an expansive, turf, their identity is a complex issue itself because, they're still known as the GPU graphics company. They've successfully turned that into AI company. But now when you have 20 different pieces of software and robotics and this, that, and the other, how do you make sure that people know that that stuff is part of what you offer? I think VMware went through that complexity because to this day, people think it just makes virtualization software, whereas it actually has, 25 other products too that maybe you might not know about. So I think that it is a non-trivial thing for NVIDIA to manage.
But they have got enough money to do just about everything that they could possibly want, right? The problem, one of their problems is how do they spend all of the revenue they've got? And it's
Right.
a fun place to be. I'm telling anybody looking for a job, if you can get a job at NVIDIA, there's probably all kinds of weird stuff going on, but you're not going to be short of funding to do a thing, right?
That's true.
That's I think, it's the current hot place to work and to go build things. And as you know, in its time back in the 90s, Sun was like that. And we've seen other companies over the years go through those phases, but it's the current hot place to work. And they're going to spawn out a whole bunch of interesting things just because of that.
Yeah. All right. On that positive note, we can conclude this episode. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to all of our listeners. And until next time, take care.
That's it for this episode of the OrionX Download Podcast. Every episode is posted to orionx.net and shared on social media. Use the comment section or tweet us with any questions or proposed topics of discussion. If you like the show, rate, review, and share it. The OrionX Download Podcast is a production of OrionX. Thank you for listening.